So I was just now scrolling on my Facebook feed, just doing a last minute check of certain groups that have various activities and things. And one of the local homeschool groups that I follow, a message popped up in it. It was from a mom, well, actually a grandma, and she started homeschooling her grandkids. She's 2 weeks into homeschooling, just 2 weeks, and she wrote that she didn't think she could do this. And I read her whole message, and I'm not going to read it to you, but it basically said that she struggled in school herself, so she went into this worried from day one that she wasn't going to be able to do this. And it's turning out exactly as hard as she feared. The kids have ADHD. They were whining and crying over every assignment. And she said it plainly that it made the whole day worse. She threatened, like we all have, more than once to just send them back to public school, but she didn't want to because her husband hadn't wanted to homeschool in the first place. And if she gave up now, it would prove him right. She mentioned she couldn't afford a tutor, so that door was closed too, and she just didn't know where to go from here. And then at the end, she said, I'm feeling lost and alone in this journey. And what hit me was that she apologized right before it, said she just needed to rant somewhere. And I kind of sat there looking at my Facebook feed and I started drafting a message, but I felt her message in my chest. Like I felt this post it deep within me, not really as advice that I needed to give, although I am going to pass some of that along today, but as a memory that I kind of sat back in myself to think about because I remember that feeling. I remember it exactly, the specific flavor of feeling like you are not going to be able to do this, your kid is not going to be able to do this. You're almost too tired to cry, too wound up to sleep, and you just kind of sit there at the end of the day, running the day back like a highlight reel of everything you've ever gotten wrong. Welcome to Continuing Education, a homeschool podcast for families. I'm Heidi. Most weeks we talk strategy, what to try, how to fix a rough spot in your homeschool day, but today's going to be a little bit different. I wanted to talk about, since it's the beginning of the school year, we're going to kind of slow down and sit with something hard. Hopefully, you come out of this a little steadier than when we started. I feel like the intention of this podcast is just to maybe pass along some of the thoughts I've had about how difficult homeschooling can be. And maybe that's because, I've been doing this for a while, or just because I see lots of posts like this where people are starting their homeschool journey and they feel really overwhelmed with it. Here's the thing about her message is that as I was reading her message, I was thinking, this really isn't about curriculum. It's not about ADHD. It's not about worksheets. Underneath all of that was something that I felt was really raw and really vulnerable. Basically, that, you know, she feels like she might be failing at this and she had no one to tell. She didn't feel like she had anyone to tell. In fact, the post was anonymous. I don't even know who this person was. It was just an anonymous post. And I just feel like we don't say this long enough. There's this like particular kind of dread that kind of shows up when you are worried about something before it even starts. And, she said it herself. She had a hard time in school, so she went and braced for failure. And that's really a heavy way to begin anything. Most of us kind of walk into new seasons hoping maybe we'll surprise ourselves, or we walk in expecting to, some kind of accomplish some kind of dream. But when you walk in expecting to confirm your worst suspicion about your own capability, and then those first 2 weeks hand you exactly enough evidence to make that suspicion feel true, that's like a unique burden to carry. When we first started homeschooling my son in first grade, I threatened him daily that public school was still very much an option. I mean, maybe it wasn't every day, but it was frequent. And I'd say it like it was some kind of consequence, like it was going to scare him straight. Looking back, I don't know who I was trying to convince more, him or me, but I wish I hadn't have threatened that. The truth is, those first few weeks were brutal. He cried over assignments. I cried after he went to bed. And underneath my frustration with him was this older, uglier thought that constantly said, you know, what made you think you could teach this? That message could have been me, word for word, almost. The worry that started before we even began, the kids melting down, the spouse, who actually, my husband has always been supportive of homeschooling, but to have a spouse that wasn't sure if this is a good idea, that's a unique challenge. The tutor that we couldn't afford, or the co-op that I didn't know existed or couldn't find, or maybe was too expensive. And underneath all of that was just this terrible fear that if it all falls apart, it proves everybody right who ever doubted you, including that version of you that maybe struggled in a classroom too. Clearly, I did not have this figured out. There were mornings I opened the curriculum and my son looked at it like I had personally wronged him. And I thought this was supposed to be the thing that fixed school for him. And instead, I've just built like a smaller, angrier version of that in my dining room. I remember, there were times that he would like throw his pencil across the room or break the pencil. And I would just kind of not really know what to do with myself. I remember after one particular day, I went into my room, and I closed the door, and I sat on the floor and I just cried. Um, and I just had to take a minute to kind of get my face to stop doing that before I walked back out there. I'm not perfect now either, but we've been homeschooling for almost a decade. And, now I have a kiddo in high school and I still have days that go sideways. But I can tell you that the version of me sitting on that floor did not believe it would ever feel different. And that's who I want to talk to tonight. Not the whole situation that this local parent had, but the belief, the one that says, if this is hard now, it will always be hard. Because that's a lot of weight to carry into your homeschool day when you're just trying to get some work done and feel like you've accomplished something. As I was kind of reflecting and drafting my reply to this mom, um, I wanted to share some thoughts that kind of went through my head. The first one there is from a man named John Holt. If you spent any time reading about homeschooling philosophy, his name probably rings a bell. He spent years watching kids in classrooms, trying to understand why bright, curious children so often shut down when it came time to learn. And he wrote this, quote, "For many years, I have been asking myself why intelligent children ask unintelligently at school. The simple answer is because they're scared." And that hits in a very special way. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. They're scared. They're not lazy. They're not defiant. They're not broken. They're scared. And those kids who are whining and crying, refusing to do homeschool, that's not them being hard-headed on purpose. And one thing I keep thinking about when I was kind of drafting my reply to this mom is if kids come out of school setting that was hard for them, or if learning has already started to feel like something that goes wrong, their bodies remember that before their brains even get a vote. And the same is true for the grown up in the room. If school was hard for you as a kid, or you don't have fond memories of a kid, sitting down to do school with your own kids can can quietly reopen something that you thought you'd closed. And it kind of triggers that nervous system or maybe even trauma in our bodies. Um, Along those lines, I read something this week that talked about like what's happening in a stressed out brain. Here's the gist of it. If I can remember correctly, I basically researchers who study how kids' brains respond to stress have found that when kids are stressed, their brains will shift away from flexible, curious thinking, and then they will go towards being more rigid and habit-based reactions. So fight, flight, freeze, or in the case of a 7 or 9-year-old, it's whine, cry, refuse. And we kind of look at this as like character flaw or some kind of failing, but it's actually what the nervous system is supposed to do. It's the nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are built to do when they don't feel safe yet. And when you add ADHD into that mix or autism or anything along those lines, that stress response often runs a lot hotter and takes a lot longer to settle. There's a psychologist named Russell Barkley who spent his whole career researching ADHD. And he has said this one line about ADHD. He says, ADHD is not about knowing what to do, but about doing what one knows. So for me, that means an ADHD kiddo can know exactly what the assignment is, know exactly how to do it, and still not be able to make their body sit down and start. And while we might think of that as like defiance or being hard headed, it's actually a gap between knowing and doing that they didn't choose and can't just muscle through on command. And shame and pressure can make that gap a lot wider rather than narrower. So when the whining kind of ramps up and the day gets harder because of it, you may think that you have like a discipline problem that you just haven't quite figured out, but it's actually just two things stacking on top of each other. Maybe a nervous system that doesn't feel safe and a brain that's working against a gap that it can't help. And neither one of those responds well to more pressure or to threats. Both respond to time. When you put those things together, hard headed isn't quite the right word. Not for your kiddos, not for my kid, um, or for any kiddo who's crying over a worksheet in a homeschool that's just 2 weeks in. What might look like stubbornness from across the table is often a body that hasn't yet decided if this new place, this new way of learning is safe. And honestly, the parent at that same table is asking their own nervous system their same exact question. The next thing I want to share as I drafted my reply was one thing that I offered in my reply. I've shared this in an inclusive devotional I did on my inclusive devotional podcast, Learn, Talk, Do. But it's a philosophy from Southern Africa called Ubuntu. And you may have heard that phrase. It comes from I am because we are. Ubuntu holds that a person only truly becomes a person through other people, not in isolation. So, not alone at a kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, scrolling a phone, wondering if you're the only one who feels like this. The message in this local homeschool group was someone who said she felt lost and alone. And she said it like an apology, like she wasn't supposed to need anyone. Like needing someone was one more way that she was failing. But Ubuntu would say the opposite. Needing people isn't a failure of your homeschool. It's just what it means to be human. And so when I replied to her, the first thing I offered wasn't a strategy or asking about curriculum. It was Starbucks. She's anonymous. I don't know if she'll reply. But when I replied to her, the first thing I offered was, hey, would you like to meet up at Starbucks? Come sit with me. Because sometimes, what we might really need is not like the right strategy, but an opportunity to sit across the table from a person who's lived through it, who's saying, yep, that's happened to me too. Someone who's willing to lend an ear. And I was thinking about that as I replied that we as a homeschool community, those of us who have been doing this for a while, we may get into our rhythms and our routines, we have our groups, but we have a lot to offer the community at large. When new homeschool families come into it, even if we don't have it figured out ourselves, we can offer a listening ear, a little bit of advice, patience, lend them our patience, knowing how long this might take for your kiddos to kind of get the gist of it. Um, I, I'll share this other thought that I had. There's a poem by Mary Oliver. It's called The Journey, and I'm going to read a piece of it. The poem says, one day you finally knew what to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. There was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. I was thinking about that line, though the whole house began to tremble, and I thought about that kind of in isolation outside of the rest of the poem, because that's kind of what it feels like, isn't it? Like it's not just your own doubt, it's the whole house. In the scenario, of this homeschooler and others that I've talked to, it's a husband who said this isn't a good idea even before you started. It's your own inner voice, maybe borrowed from some teacher decades ago when you were sitting in school, telling you that you were never the smart one. Or it's the tutor that you can't afford, reminding you that you're doing this alone without a backup plan and you're going to fail these kids. And it's all of it shouting at once. Every voice cries out, meaning essentially go back to the way it was. It was easier for me that way. And I think about this fear of proving other people right. And I want to offer this gentle advice. I don't know that this is about proving people right or wrong. That the voices in the poem shouting at your voice, tugging at your ankles, the real work, the only work, is finding your own voice underneath all of that noise. The one that knows your kids, that knows this season, that gets to decide what happens next without needing anyone's permission to be scared along the way. A hard 2 weeks isn't a verdict and it's not proof of anything. So if you are at the beginning of this homeschool journey and you are questioning whether or not you can go the distance, it's not proof that school is going to go one way or the other. It's just the beginning of something of what the beginning of something honestly looks like, especially when everyone at the tail, kids and grown up, both of you, if you're carrying old stuff into the new season. Homeschool families, sometimes, I mean, we, a lot of homeschool families will take a season, for deschooling. And it's the idea that after leaving a school setting, even if you've had a summer, everybody, kids and parents, need real time to unlearn what school used to feel like before a new, gentler rhythm can kind of take root. And it's really not wasted time. I have a podcast episode about this, and I'll try to link it in the show notes. That it really is good to take some time to deschool. You will not fall behind, that it's actually the first step to homeschooling, especially if you have kids that are pushing back or feel stress or trauma related to school. And here's something that I wish someone had kind of told me more plainly back when my own son was, 6 and melting down over workbooks. Homeschool is not supposed to look like public school. A traditional school day is 6, 7 hours long, and a huge amount of that time isn't spent on instruction. It's things like lining up or passing out papers or taking attendance, waiting your turn, transitioning between rooms. There's so much time that's quote unquote wasted time in schools. I mean, it's not wasted. They're doing things, but it's not on instruction and it's not kids actively doing the work. So if your kids came from that, they may be bracing for hours of grinding work because that's what school trained them to expect, whether they're actively doing work or just doing the work of work, which is learning how to be in a line, you know, taking attendance, being quiet, waiting your turn. That can be really stressful for some kids, especially if they have ADHD or they like to move. So school trained them in a certain way, and you've got to untrain them. So you can let a lesson take 15 minutes instead of an hour. You can let your kids lead a little, maybe follow curiosity down the rabbit hole. You can close the book early on a hard day. You can play hooky and skip out altogether and go to the water park or go to the arcade or go grab lunch at McDonald's. What learning actually gets to feel like when nobody's forcing it into someone else's shape is whatever you want it to feel like and look like. I want to tell you a little bit about what's happened because I don't just want to leave you with a poem and some random thoughts and no proof that it gets better, right? It does get better. My son's nervous system did calm down. In public school, he would end the day angry and upset, like every single day, like clockwork. It would be like 4 o'clock. That's just what it looked like in our house, was slam doors, upset, feeling angry, sad. And over time, that stopped being the default. I got my happy kid back. But I want to be honest about the timeline because while While it did get a lot better after a few weeks, a couple months maybe, I think we do people a disservice when we skip this part. It was not just like a few weeks into it and things calmed down. It took time, a lot of it. It it took more than a semester. If I'm being totally honest, it took a year or two before I felt like he'd truly settled in, before his body seemed to believe all the way down that this new rhythm was safe and wasn't going anywhere. And part of that was that I had to stop threatening him with public school, because the more that I threatened that, the more that it was no longer a safe place. And and even as I say that, I don't want to hand you like this tidy ending story where the conflict just disappeared entirely, because we still have hard days. Um, he's a teenager now. That comes with its own territory. We're getting into much more difficult work. It requires more time. We have battles over taking notes and, you know, spending the time that we think it might be time that needs to be spent on this, or taking certain classes. But it stopped being that same daily whole body dread. It became kind of regular, ordinary friction, instead of like this nervous system that was kind of stuck in fight or flight mode. And that's the part that took a year or more. That's the part that I think is worth waiting for in general. If you want to bring today's episode, if you're starting the journey and you kind of want to chat with your kiddos about it, I'm going to offer some questions. With our devotionals, we like to kind of do this learn, talk, do concept. So I'm going to offer some talk concept, because one thing that I think helped me and my kiddos with homeschooling was kind of including them, helping them feel empowered in their education, giving them choices, and kind of talking about what would a good homeschool day look like for them. So one thing that you might ask is like, what feels scary about homeschool? Or what feels scary about school? And then maybe what's something that used to feel scary but doesn't anymore? And then how did that happen? It can be a gentle way to kind of talk about fear shrinking without even mentioning, the specific tasks that they might feel dread over. For kids who've spent time in a classroom before, you could ask, was there ever a moment at school where you just felt like your brain just stopped working? What was happening around you when that happened? And then let them describe it. You don't need to fix it, just listen. But this gives you a lot of insight into your kiddo about what they might find stressful and what they might um, kind of be having a trauma response around. For older kids or teens, you could say things like, actually, you can even offer this for elementary school. Let's not limit this to older kids. When do you feel like you actually learn best? When do you feel like you're just getting through it? And this one can be really eye-opening, because we might think that our kid has a certain learning style, but we find out that they have a different kind of learning style, or maybe they are omni-learning where they have multiple methods. Um, and then you can use that to feel, more empowered in how you instruct them, the type of curriculum, what videos or activities that you choose for them. And then you could also ask, who's someone you feel safe enough to be honest with when things are hard? Because if the answer is, well, not you, mom, because I don't, you're going to give me more work or whatever it is, make sure they have someone to chat with too. Um, Maybe you could ask, what's your easiest part of today and what was the hardest? Or what was the best part of your day and what was the hardest part of your day? Not to grade the day, but just to kind of hear it out loud together. And that can be something that you can take action on, or that you can just know more about your own kiddo. If you are 2 weeks in or 2 years in, and you're wondering whether or not you're the only one who's cried on the floor over a worksheet, you are not. This work is allowed to be hard, but that hardness doesn't have to mean anything about whether or not it's working. And you're allowed to need other people too. So, wherever you're at tonight, I hope that you find your own voice underneath all the noise, all the other voices that may be screaming at you, the way that that poem talked about. And I hope, if you need it, you find your own version of Starbucks, a real person across a real table who already knows exactly what you're describing. I'm Heidi. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Please go easy on yourself today, and we'll chat with you soon.